The Poverty of Philosophy, 1847, by Karl Marx, a critical response to Proudhon. It was the year 1847. Europe was trembling under the weight of change. The smoke of industry blackened the skies, the gears of capitalism turned relentlessly, and in the factories of Manchester and Lyon, workers toiled 16 hours a day for barely enough to survive. The world was moving faster than its thinkers could explain it. Philosophers wrote of freedom, economists spoke of progress, and politicians preached reform, but the poor remained poor, and the rich grew ever richer. Amid this restless storm of ideas and injustice, a 29-year-old Karl Marx picked up his pen to wage an intellectual war that would echo for centuries. His target was not a tyrant or a king, but a fellow philosopher, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the celebrated French socialist who had just published The Philosophy of Poverty. Proudhon had called for justice, equality, and harmony between classes. But to Marx, his vision was naive, confused, and dangerously sentimental. Marx believed Proudhon's philosophy was like a map drawn by someone who had never seen the terrain of history. He admired Proudhon's courage, but not his logic. So, in a blaze of passion and precision, Marx wrote The Poverty of Philosophy, a counterattack that would expose the illusions of utopian socialism and declare a new way of understanding society, scientific socialism. This was Marx before Das Kapital, younger, sharper, and fearless. In this book, we witness the moment he turns from mere critic to revolutionary scientist, a thinker who insists that to understand society, one must analyze the material conditions of life, not moral wishes or abstract ideals. Through his fierce debate with Proudhon, Marx sharpens his weapons: class struggle, labor value, and dialectical materialism, the tools that would later build his greatest work, Das Kapital. As we enter the pages of The Poverty of Philosophy, we don't just study a debate between two men, we witness the birth of a worldview. Marx's pen burns with the anger of injustice and the thrill of discovery. Every sentence cuts deeper into the heart of capitalism, and every argument pushes him closer to the theory that would change history. So let us begin. Step into 1847, into the heat of revolution and the forge of ideas, where Marx first discovers that poverty is not a mystery to be explained by philosophy, but a product of the very system that claims to bring progress. Here begins the story of a man who refused to moralize poverty and chose instead to reveal its mechanism. Open Book Chapter 1, The Challenge of Proudhon, Idealism versus Reality. The year is 1847, and Europe stands on the edge of revolution. Factories roar like beasts of iron. Cities swell with laborers leaving the countryside, their hands calloused, their dreams fading. Philosophers debate liberty, justice, and progress, but for millions, those words mean little when there's no bread on the table. In this storm of social change, two minds rise above the noise: Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Karl Marx, each claiming to understand the secret structure of society. Both dream of a world free from exploitation. Yet between them lies a gulf as wide as the chasm separating worker and master. Proudhon, a French socialist thinker, had just published a book that sent ripples through the European intellectual world: The Philosophy of Poverty, La Philosophie de la Misère. He believed that society's inequalities could be solved through balance by creating justice between labor and capital, harmony between workers and employers. His message appealed to those who feared revolution but still longed for reform. Proudhon spoke of morality, justice, and mutualism, a peaceful exchange between equals, a world where exploitation would vanish through goodwill and fair trade. It was, in many ways, a noble dream. But to Karl Marx, this dream was not only naive, it was dangerous. Marx had seen the world too closely to believe in moral harmony. He saw children in coal mines, women bent over looms, men dying in the filth of factories, all while the owners of production reaped unimaginable wealth. He understood that the misery of the poor was not a moral accident, it was a structural necessity of capitalism itself. To him, Proudhon's vision was like painting over cracks in a collapsing wall. The structure itself had to change. Proudhon, the philosopher of justice. To understand why Marx reacted so sharply, we must first understand who Proudhon was. Born into a modest family in France, Proudhon rose through hardship, self-education, and determination. His most famous claim, "Property is theft," made him an instant celebrity among radicals. He saw private property not as a natural right, but as the root of exploitation. Yet, paradoxically, Proudhon did not reject property entirely. He wanted a society where property would be balanced by mutual cooperation, a world of free producers exchanging their labor fairly. In the philosophy of poverty, Proudhon tried to create a grand system of economics based on justice, balance, and reason. He imagined that by understanding the moral laws of society, humanity could reform the economy peacefully. He believed contradictions like poverty and wealth, labor and capital could be harmonized through moral equilibrium. For him, history was a series of moral oppositions seeking resolution through understanding, not revolution. This was where Marx saw the first fatal flaw. For him, Proudhon's method was philosophical, not scientific. It spoke in the language of ideals, not in the language of historical materialism. Proudhon looked at the world and asked, what ought to be? Marx looked and asked, what is and why? Marx's anger, philosophy versus reality. When Marx picked up Proudhon's book in Brussels, he read it with growing disbelief. Line after line, Proudhon used abstract oppositions, good versus evil, justice versus injustice, to explain the economy. Marx realized that this was the same old philosophical method that German idealists like Hegel had used to explain history. But while Hegel's dialectic was at least grand in scope, Proudhon's version, in Marx's eyes, was a shallow imitation. Marx decided to respond. He titled his work "The Poverty of Philosophy," a deliberate inversion of Proudhon's title. The message was clear: Proudhon's philosophy was itself the source of poverty in understanding. You explain misery through philosophy, Marx seemed to say, but I will explain philosophy through misery. Marx opened his critique not with anger, but with precision. He pointed out that Proudhon treated economic categories like value, rent, and wages as eternal truths, not as products of a particular historical system. Proudhon saw them as moral problems to be balanced. Marx saw them as social relations born from material production. For example, Proudhon thought the relationship between worker and employer could be made fair through mutual exchange. Marx countered that this was impossible within capitalism, because the entire system was built on the exploitation of labor. Workers sold their labor power, but they never received the full value of what they produced. The surplus, the profit, was extracted by the capitalist. Justice, Marx argued, cannot exist in a system based on unequal ownership of production. To Marx, Proudhon's moral optimism was like prescribing poetry for a disease that needed surgery. The problem was not lack of fairness, it was the ownership of labor itself. The clash of methods, utopian versus scientific. This clash between Marx and Proudhon was more than a personal quarrel, it symbolized a turning point in the history of socialist thought. Proudhon represented what Marx would later call utopian socialism, a form of idealistic dreaming that ignored the real economic forces shaping society. Marx, in contrast, stood for scientific socialism, a method grounded in material analysis, class relations, and historical development. To Proudhon, society's contradictions like wealth and poverty were eternal moral dilemmas. To Marx, they were the results of economic evolution. He applied the dialectical method not to ideas, but to material life. Every mode of production, he said, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Capitalism, with its constant drive for profit, would eventually undermine itself by creating a class of workers too large, too exploited, and too conscious to remain silent. This was the birth of Marx's historical materialism, the idea that history moves not through moral improvement but through the conflict of classes. Proudhon wanted reconciliation. Marx saw revolution as the only resolution. The two men even differed on what freedom meant. For Proudhon, freedom was the moral equality of individuals cooperating. For Marx, freedom meant the collective control of production, ending the domination of one class over another. Proudhon's freedom was ethical, Marx's freedom was economic and structural. Why Marx's critique still matters. If this sounds like a purely academic dispute, it was anything but. The issues Marx raised in The Poverty of Philosophy still echo in modern debates about reform and revolution, capitalism and social justice. Proudhon's vision of fair exchange lives on today in the language of ethical capitalism, fair trade, and corporate responsibility. Marx's critique warns us that such measures, while comforting, may not change the structure of power beneath them. For instance, when a company pays fair wages but still owns all means of production, the fundamental relation of exploitation remains. Marx would argue that until workers control production, they remain bound by the same invisible chains. The conversation between Proudhon and Marx thus represents two timeless moral instincts, the hope for peaceful reform and the demand for radical transformation. The human side of the battle. What makes this debate so fascinating is that it was not just theoretical, it was emotional. Marx and Proudhon had once admired each other. They exchanged letters, praised each other's work, and shared the dream of social liberation. But when The Philosophy of Poverty appeared, Marx felt betrayed not personally, but intellectually. To him, Proudhon's book was a retreat into abstraction, a betrayal of the working class's real struggle. In one of his letters, Marx warned Proudhon, "Do not set yourself up as the doctrinaire of the proletariat. The movement will be strong enough without your making yourself responsible for it." That warning turned prophetic. Within a year, Proudhon was marginalized by more radical thinkers, and Marx's ideas began to dominate revolutionary circles. But beneath Marx's polemic was also disappointment. He saw in Proudhon a lost opportunity, a man who could have advanced socialism but instead chose to moralize it. Marx's tone in The Poverty of Philosophy is harsh, sometimes even mocking, yet it carries the passion of someone defending truth against illusion. The core argument: value, labor, and exploitation. At the heart of Marx's attack was the concept of value. Proudhon believed value was determined by a balance between supply and demand, moral fairness between buyers and sellers. Marx destroyed this notion. He argued that value comes from labor, from the human effort embodied in commodities. When a worker makes a product, its value reflects the labor time required to produce it. Yet the worker receives only a wage, which represents a fraction of that value. The rest's surplus value becomes profit for the capitalist. This is the secret engine of capitalism, Marx said, and the reason why poverty persists even when productivity rises. Proudhon wanted to equalize exchange, Marx wanted to abolish wage labor itself. The very idea of fair exchange between labor and capital, Marx argued, is a contradiction because one side owns the means of production, and the other has only its labor to sell. This argument would later become the foundation of Marx's economic theory in Das Kapital, but in The Poverty of Philosophy, we see it taking shape for the first time. It is here that Marx begins to think like a scientist of society rather than a moral preacher. Dialectics in the real world. Marx also accused Proudhon of misunderstanding Hegelian dialectics, the philosophical method of examining contradictions to reveal progress. Proudhon tried to use Hegel's method but treated contradictions as moral opposites to be harmonized. Marx, instead, treated contradictions as historical forces that drive change. For example, in capitalism, the contradiction between capital and labor cannot be balanced, it must explode. It is not a matter of ethics but of economics. The system demands profit, and profit demands exploitation. Therefore, any moral appeal to fairness is bound to fail. This distinction between philosophical dialectic and material dialectic was crucial. Proudhon's dialectic lived in ideas, Marx's dialectic lived in factories. That is why Marx called his work the poverty of philosophy, because philosophy alone, detached from the material world, could not explain history. A turning point in Marx's evolution. By the time Marx finished the book, he had done more than refute Proudhon, he had discovered himself. His criticism forced him to clarify his own ideas, sharpening them into a coherent worldview. In a sense, the poverty of philosophy was Marx's apprenticeship before Das Kapital. He learned that true understanding of society required analyzing production, class, and labor, not moral ideals. He realized that history was not driven by ideas, but by the struggle between those who own and those who work. And he saw, perhaps for the first time, that the coming revolution would not be philosophical, it would be material, political, and unstoppable. The end of the chapter, the stage is set. As 1847 drew to a close, Marx stood at the threshold of history. Within a year, Europe would erupt in the revolutions of 1848, and Marx would write the Communist Manifesto, giving shape to the ideas born in this very battle with Proudhon. Looking back, we can see the poverty of philosophy as more than a critique, it was the rehearsal for revolution. Here, Marx draws the line between idealism and materialism, between moral hope and historical necessity. He exposes the limits of reform and plants the seed of a new science of society. In rejecting Proudhon's dream of harmony, Marx found his own destiny not as a dreamer, but as a diagnostician of reality. The young philosopher who once admired abstract thought now declared war on abstraction itself. The idealist had become a materialist. The critic had become a revolutionary. And history, from that point forward, would never think of poverty the same way again. Open Book Chapter 2, The Science of Capital. Marx defines value and labor. When Karl Marx set down his pen after finishing The Poverty of Philosophy, he was not simply ending an argument with Proudhon, he was beginning a lifelong investigation into the deepest engine of human history, the economic structure of society. In 1847, Marx stood at a crossroads. The European world was shifting beneath his feet, industrial machines roared louder than monarchs, and the age-old moral questions of good and evil were being replaced by new, terrifying ones: who owns? Who works? Who profits? Philosophy alone could no longer answer these questions. What was needed was science, a science of capital, a way to measure and understand the invisible forces that ruled over modern life. This is where Marx begins to transform from philosopher into economic anatomist. The Poverty of Philosophy is the book where he starts dissecting capitalism like a living organism. He studies its bones: production, value, exchange, and finds its beating heart, labor. In this chapter, we'll journey through that transformation, how Marx builds a new method, a new vocabulary, and a new vision of history. We'll move from the moral illusions of utopian socialism to the precise logic of scientific socialism, where poverty, profit, and power are not accidents, but outcomes of laws as real as gravity. So, let's step inside Marx's laboratory of ideas and see how he begins to decode the hidden science of capital. 1. The need for a science of society. For centuries, thinkers had tried to understand wealth and poverty. Adam Smith spoke of the invisible hand guiding markets, Ricardo analyzed value in terms of cost and trade, Proudhon dreamed of moral equilibrium. But all of them, Marx argued, started in the wrong place. They looked at exchange, circulation, and money, the surface of economic life. Marx wanted to go deeper, into the production process itself. To him, society was not built on ideas but on the way humans produce their material needs: food, clothing, shelter. Everything else, politics, religion, art, philosophy, rose from that foundation. This was his first great insight. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but their social being that determines their consciousness. This sentence, deceptively simple, overturns centuries of thought. It means that how we live, work, and produce shapes what we think and believe, not the other way around. The church, the state, even morality, these are not eternal truths, but reflections of the economic structure of a given era. Thus, Marx called for a science of society that would study the laws of motion of this economic structure. Just as Newton revealed gravity behind physical motion, Marx sought to reveal the laws behind social motion, the dynamics of classes, production, and exploitation. 2. Labor, the source of value. In The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx lays the cornerstone of his entire economic theory, the labor theory of value. He begins with a simple question: what gives things their value? Why is a diamond more valuable than bread, even though bread is more useful? Economists before him answered vaguely: supply and demand, rarity, utility. Marx wasn't satisfied. He observed that, beneath all commodities, there was one common element: human labor. Every product, whether a loaf of bread or a diamond ring, represents a certain amount of human effort, measured in time and skill. Labor, he said, is the substance of value. Imagine 2 chairs. One takes 2 hours to make, the other 4. If the same kind of labor and materials are used, the second chair has roughly twice the value of the first. Value, in Marx's sense, is not about usefulness, but about socially necessary labor time, the average amount of work required to produce something under normal conditions. This concept may sound abstract, but it's profoundly human. It means that behind every price tag lies a hidden story of effort, sweat, and time. When we exchange goods, we are really exchanging pieces of human life. But Marx doesn't stop there. He notices something strange: workers sell their labor to capitalists, but they never receive the full value of what they produce. Here lies the secret of surplus value, the engine of capitalism. 3. Surplus value, the hidden theft in plain sight. Let's take an example. Imagine a factory worker making shoes. In one day, she produces 10 pairs worth $100 each, $1,000 total. But she is paid only $100 for the day's work. Where does the remaining $900 go? To the capitalist, of course. But why? Marx explains: the worker sells her labor power, the ability to work, not the full value of what she creates. Her wage covers only the cost of keeping her alive and able to work again tomorrow: food, shelter, minimal comfort. But her labor produces far more value than that. The difference between what she creates and what she's paid is surplus value, and that surplus is the source of all profit. This realization was revolutionary. It stripped away the moral illusion of fair exchange. Under capitalism, Every contract between worker and employer appears equal, but it hides a deep asymmetry. The worker owns only her labor, the capitalist owns the means of production. One sells necessity, the other buys power. Marx compared this to a magician's trick. On the surface, everyone seems free. In reality, the system ensures that labor constantly generates wealth for others. Capital grows not from saving or genius, but from unpaid labor, the invisible theft built into the structure itself. This was the heart of Marx's argument against Proudhon. You can't fix exploitation through fairness, he said, because exploitation is the mechanism of the system. For capital as a social relationship. To understand this fully, Marx urges us to stop seeing capital as a pile of money or machines. Capital is not a thing, it's a social relationship. It exists wherever labor produces surplus for someone else. A machine in itself is just metal and gears. It becomes capital only when it is used to extract surplus value from workers. A landlord, a banker, an industrialist, all are capitalists not because of moral character but because of their position in this relationship. Proudhon imagined that society could moralize this relationship, make the exchange between capital and labor just. Marx replies, you cannot moralize a system built on appropriation. The only way to end exploitation is to end the private ownership of production itself. Here, Marx begins to see capitalism as a historical phase, a necessary stage in human development that creates immense wealth but also its own contradictions. Capitalism revolutionizes technology and productivity, yet it impoverishes those who make it possible. It gives birth to its own gravediggers, the working class. 5. The dialectic of capitalism. Marx borrowed from Hegel the idea of dialectics, that contradictions drive change, but he turned it on its head. For Hegel, contradictions existed in ideas; for Marx, they lived in material life. Capitalism's central contradiction, he argued, is between the forces of production, technology, industry, labor, and the relations of production, ownership, control, power. As technology grows, the social relations that once fitted private ownership, wage labor, become obstacles. This tension pushes society toward crisis. Periods of overproduction lead to economic crashes, unemployment, and unrest. Each crisis is a symptom of a deeper disease, the mismatch between the immense productive power of humanity and the narrow ownership of that power by a few. For Marx, these crises are not accidental, they are the dialectic of capitalism itself, the way the system evolves and eventually undermines its own foundations. The same forces that make it strong, innovation, competition, expansion, also prepare its collapse. 6. From economics to class struggle. In The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx introduces a phrase that would define his entire philosophy: the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Every economic system, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, divides people into classes, those who own and those who work. Their conflict, sometimes open, sometimes hidden, drives history forward. In capitalism, the conflict is between the bourgeoisie, owners of capital, and the proletariat, workers. The bourgeoisie controls production, the state, the press, and culture itself. The proletariat, deprived of ownership, is forced to sell labor to survive. But Marx saw something new: unlike previous oppressed classes, the working class has no property to defend and no interest in partial reform. Its liberation requires the abolition of class society itself. This is why Marx viewed the working class not just as victims, but as the agents of history, the ones destined to transform society from within. This idea was explosive. It gave the poor not pity, but power. 7. The transition from philosophy to science. What makes the poverty of philosophy such a crucial turning point is that Marx, for the first time, treats society as a system governed by laws, not as a moral drama. He studies economic categories: wages, profit, rent, as scientists study elements. He searches for the underlying structure, the relationships that remain constant beneath the surface of change. Just as Darwin later revealed the evolution of species, Marx begins to reveal the evolution of economic systems. He shows that capitalism, far from being eternal, is one stage in a long historical process. Before it came feudalism, before that, slavery. Each mode of production, he argues, rises, develops, and falls when its internal contradictions become unbearable. Thus, Marx's analysis gives history a direction from primitive cooperation to class domination, and eventually to classless society. This is not prophecy, but logic. If social relations are human-made, they can be human-changed. 8. The human meaning of labor. While Marx's theory is scientific, it's also deeply human. For him, labor is not just economic activity, it's the essence of human life. Through labor, humans shape nature and express creativity. But under capitalism, this creativity is stolen. The worker becomes alienated from the product, which belongs to the capitalist, from the process, which is mechanical, from others, through competition, and even from himself, as labor becomes mere survival. This idea of alienation, first developed in Marx's earlier writings, finds its economic foundation here. It's not only moral sadness, it's structural. Capitalism turns living labor into dead capital. What the worker creates in the morning, enslaves him by evening. Marx's scientific analysis, then, is not cold, it's full of quiet rage. He speaks not as an observer, but as a witness to a theft repeated daily across the world. 9. Why this still matters today. More than 170 years later, Marx's questions remain hauntingly relevant. When we ask why billionaires exist beside starving families, why automation threatens jobs instead of liberating workers, why recessions repeat like seasons, we are still inside the logic Marx uncovered. Modern economists speak of productivity and markets, but they often ignore the simple question Marx asked: who benefits from the labor of millions? His answer that profit is unpaid labor still challenges every theory that claims capitalism can be made fair. In our time, we can see both Marx and Proudhon reborn, one in the idealistic hope of ethical capitalism, the other in the cold analysis of systemic inequality. But history, so far, has sided with Marx's realism. 10. A step toward Das Kapital. By the end of the poverty of philosophy, Marx had discovered the skeleton of his masterpiece, Das Kapital. The ideas of labor value, surplus, and class struggle would later be refined into a monumental economic theory. Yet, it's important to remember that this discovery didn't come from a laboratory, it came from a war of ideas. Marx's duel with Proudhon forced him to build intellectual weapons sharper than moral hope, analysis, evidence, history. If Proudhon dreamed of justice, Marx revealed the mechanism of injustice. He turned socialism from a wish into a method. Conclusion: the birth of the economic revolution. In the poverty of philosophy, Marx achieved something extraordinary. He changed the very way humanity could think about society. He took abstract ideals and replaced them with laws of motion, turning philosophy into a science. He showed that labor is not just toil, it is the creative force of humanity. He exposed that capital is not just wealth, it is power over others' labor. And he revealed that poverty is not a mystery, it is the inevitable shadow cast by profit. This was the moment Marx stopped asking, what should society be, and began asking, What is society becoming? From that question, an entire movement was born, a movement that would shape revolutions, inspire nations, and terrify empires. And it all began with one young man, in a small room in Brussels, determined to prove that the poverty of philosophy could only be answered by the philosophy of reality. Blue Book Chapter 3, From Utopia to Science, Marx's Breakthrough. When Karl Marx published The Poverty of Philosophy in 1847, he probably didn't know that this sharp, polemical book would mark the decisive turning point in his intellectual journey. It was the moment when he crossed the bridge from the passionate moral socialism of his youth to the rigorous, scientific socialism that would later define his mature thought in Das Kapital. The fight with Proudhon wasn't merely personal or rhetorical, it was transformational. It forced Marx to clarify, sharpen, and systematize his ideas about how society truly works. In this final chapter, we'll explore how the poverty of philosophy transformed Marx's thinking, introduced a new science of history, and prepared the ground for his later revolutionary theories. 1. The death of utopian dreams. Before Marx, socialism lived largely in the realm of dreamers, idealists who imagined perfect societies governed by harmony, cooperation, and moral justice. Figures like Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, and Proudhon himself envisioned a world where everyone could share equally, where work would be joyful, and where conflict could be resolved through reason or moral persuasion. To Marx, these visions, while noble, missed the point. They treated society as if it were a moral puzzle, not a material process. Marx saw that these utopian socialists were building castles in the air. They proposed what should be without asking what causes things to be as they are. Their theories were like remedies prescribed without understanding the disease. In The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx performs what could be called the funeral of utopian socialism. He doesn't dismiss their compassion, he respects their humanity, but he buries their methods. He declares that society cannot be changed by ideals alone. It must be changed by understanding the laws that govern it. He writes, in essence, do not moralize poverty, explain it. Do not appeal to justice, analyze production. Do not dream of equality, study history. This is where Marx's thought takes a historic leap. For the first time, he asserts that the key to human society lies not in morality, philosophy, or politics, but in economics, in the real, material way people make and exchange the things they need to live. 2. History as a science. Marx's most groundbreaking idea in The Poverty of Philosophy is his transformation of history into a science. For centuries, historians had told stories of kings, wars, and great ideas. Marx turned this tradition upside down. He proposed that history is not primarily the story of rulers or thinkers, it is the story of economic systems and class struggles. The driving force of history, he argued, is not ideas but material production, how people organize themselves to survive, to work, to trade, and to profit. This insight, what we now call historical materialism, was revolutionary. It was like putting history under a microscope for the first time. To understand the French Revolution, Marx said, you must study not just the writings of Rousseau or the speeches of Robespierre, but also the rise of the bourgeoisie, the new capitalist class that gained power through commerce and industry. Ideas follow production, not the other way around. This scientific lens also explains why Marx rejected Proudhon's call for eternal justice. For Marx, justice itself is a historical concept. What is considered just under feudalism, a serf obeying his lord, becomes unjust under capitalism, and what is just in capitalism, a wage laborer selling his work freely, will appear unjust in a future socialist society. Justice, like everything else, evolves with the mode of production. There are no eternal moral laws floating above history, only changing social relations born of material necessity. This realization turned Marx into something new, a scientist of society. He wasn't content to describe suffering, he wanted to uncover the mechanism that produced it. 3. The anatomy of capitalism. One of the most fascinating parts of the poverty of philosophy is how Marx begins dissecting capitalism as if it were a living organism. He examines its anatomy, the relations between workers, capitalists, machines, and markets. He points out that capitalism is a dynamic system, always in motion, always transforming. Unlike Proudhon, who imagined society as a collection of eternal principles, Marx saw capitalism as a historical phase, something that was born, grew, and would one day die. He observes that capitalism thrives on contradictions. It must constantly expand, seeking new markets and cheaper labor. Yet, this very process creates instability and crisis. The same forces that produce wealth also produce poverty. He gives a striking example: as machines become more efficient, fewer workers are needed. Productivity rises, but so does unemployment. The worker becomes superfluous, even as the capitalist grows richer. This, Marx says, is the engine of class conflict. Capitalism, in Marx's eyes, is both creative and destructive. It builds cities, transforms industries, and accelerates progress, but at the cost of alienating the very people whose labor makes it all possible. This analysis, embryonic in the poverty of philosophy, will later explode in Das Kapital into a full-blown theory of surplus value and exploitation. But even here, in 1847, we see the skeleton of that idea forming, that the profit of the capitalist is nothing more than unpaid labor, the difference between what the worker produces and what he is paid. 4. The revolution within the revolution. Marx did not simply want to interpret the world, he wanted to change it. This, perhaps more than anything, separates him from Proudhon. Where Proudhon dreamed of reform, of creating mutualist communities where workers could exchange goods fairly, Marx envisioned revolution. He believed that capitalism would not gently evolve into a better system. It would have to be overthrown, its contradictions bursting into conflict, its classes clashing until a new order emerged. This was not wishful thinking, it was a prediction rooted in his analysis of economic laws. Marx saw revolution as the inevitable outcome of capitalism's internal tensions. The bourgeoisie, by developing industry and concentrating wealth, also creates its own gravedigger, the working class. He writes, in a tone that's both prophetic and chilling, the hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist. Each stage of production brings its own ruling class and its own struggle. For Marx, then, history is not a peaceful evolution, it's a battlefield. Progress comes not through compromise, but through conflict. And that conflict, driven by material necessity, is the heartbeat of history itself. 5. Beyond philosophy, the birth of economic critique. In challenging Proudhon, Marx didn't just attack one man's book, he demolished an entire tradition of philosophical idealism. For centuries, philosophers had tried to explain the world through pure thought, ideas, logic, morality, or spirit. Marx turned this on its head. He insisted that to understand the world, one must start not with thought, but with life, the concrete realities of work, food, shelter, and production. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, he would later write. The point, however, is to change it. The poverty of philosophy was his first real attempt to live by that motto. In it, Marx abandoned speculation for analysis, replaced moral appeals with scientific explanation, and transformed socialism from a dream into a discipline. He began using the methods that would later define Das Kapital: empirical observation, historical comparison, and the analysis of contradictions. He laid the foundation for what we now call political economy, the study of how wealth is produced and distributed within different social systems. By the time he finished The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx was no longer just a radical journalist or a political exile. He had become something entirely new, the first true scientist of society. 6. Legacy and Echoes. Though The Poverty of Philosophy was a relatively short and early work, its influence has been enormous. It shaped not only Marx's later writings but also the entire tradition of socialist thought that followed. It taught that socialism must be based on analysis, not sentiment. It gave later thinkers a method, not just a dream. Lenin, Engels, and countless others would take up this method, applying it to new contexts and struggles. Ironically, even those who disagreed with Marx, modern economists, sociologists, and political scientists, owe him a debt. His insistence that economic relations lie at the core of human history changed how every serious thinker approached the study of society. And yet, The Poverty of Philosophy retains something deeply human. Beneath its sharp logic and biting sarcasm, there burns a moral passion, the voice of a man who could not look at the misery of workers and remain neutral. Marx's analysis was scientific, but his motivation was profoundly ethical. He wanted to reveal the mechanisms of exploitation so that humanity could free itself from them. 7. Conclusion: The Birth of a New Mind. When the book appeared in 1847, few noticed it. It was dense, polemical, and written in the feverish style of a man fighting on too many fronts. But history would soon prove that The Poverty of Philosophy was far more than a quarrel between two thinkers. It was the birth cry of a new worldview. In it, Marx found his method. He discovered that history is not the playground of ideas but the stage of material struggle. He uncovered the logic of economic systems and the forces that drive their rise and fall. He saw, for the first time, that the liberation of humanity would not come from abstract justice, but from the abolition of class society itself. From that point on, Marx's path was clear. Within 20 years, he would publish Das Kapital, the monumental work that grew directly from the soil of this earlier book. And so, when we read The Poverty of Philosophy today, we are not just reading a critique of Proudhon, we are witnessing the moment Marx became Marx. He entered the debate as a philosopher. He left it as a scientist of revolution. And history has never been the same since.